The cold waters of San Francisco Bay have always been unforgiving. The currents are relentless. The fog, thick enough to swallow you whole. And in the middle of it all, a slab of rock, jagged and unwelcoming. Alcatraz. For over a century, this island has been a paradox, both a fortress of justice and a place of nightmares. The world knows it as the Rock, a place from which no prisoner was supposed to escape. And yet, even now, decades after it closed, people still argue over whether that was ever true. It's been more than 60 years since the last prisoner left these crumbling walls. Tourists roam the cell blocks now, snapping photos of rusted bars, peeling paint, and faded guard towers. The air smells faintly of salt water and mildew, but if you stand still long enough, you can almost hear it: the clang of iron doors, the shuffle of chains, the whispers of desperate men planning their next move. And today, in a world facing new waves of crime and chaos, there's a question echoing in certain government circles. Could Alcatraz reopen? Before it became America's most notorious penitentiary, Alcatraz was a military fort. Built in the 1850s, its location was strategic, a sentinel guarding the entrance to San Francisco Bay. The currents made escape by water nearly impossible. For decades, it was a military prison home to deserters, mutineers, and enemy soldiers during wartime. But in 1934, during the rise of organized crime in America, the U.S. Department of Justice decided it needed something more, a place to hold the most dangerous, the most cunning, and the most unrepentant criminals in the nation. That's when Alcatraz was transformed into a maximum security, minimum privilege federal prison. If you came here, it was because you'd made trouble somewhere else. This wasn't your first prison, it was your last stop. No one came to Alcatraz to start over. They came here to disappear. For the next 29 years, it housed legends of crime. Al Capone, the ruthless Chicago mob boss; George Machine Gun Kelly, the gangster whose name struck fear in the 1930s; and Robert Stroud, the infamous Birdman of Alcatraz. Every detail of the prison was designed with one goal: containment. Cells were small, barely 5 feet by 9 feet. Lights stayed on almost 24 hours a day. Prisoners had no privacy. The guards, armed, trained, and stationed everywhere. The cold Pacific waters around the island were just as much a guard as the men with rifles. The currents could drag you out to sea in minutes. Hypothermia would kill you long before you reached the shore. And yet, men tried. 36 inmates attempted escape in 14 separate incidents. Most were caught, some were killed, and a few vanished. The most famous of them all, the 1962 escape of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. They chiseled through cell walls with spoons, crafted dummy heads to fool the guards, and set off into the night on a makeshift raft of raincoats. The official story says they drowned. Unofficially, no bodies were ever found. By 1963, Alcatraz was falling apart. Salt water had eaten away at the concrete. The cost of running the island was astronomical, nearly 3 times that of other prisons, and the government, under growing public scrutiny, shut it down. The last prisoner left on March 21, 1963. The gates clanged shut, and for a time, it seemed Alcatraz would fade into history. But it didn't. It became something else: an icon, a tourist attraction, a haunted relic of a darker era. People came from around the world to walk its echoing halls, to stand in the cells of gangsters and murderers, to imagine the terror of being locked away with no way out. Because the world is different now. In the past decade, American prisons have faced problems that eerily mirror the challenges of the 1930s. Overcrowding, inmates packed into facilities beyond their designed capacity, escalating violence, in-prison gang wars, riots, and assaults on staff, high-profile escapes, rare but devastating to public trust when they happen. In certain closed-door meetings, some lawmakers and law enforcement officials have floated a provocative idea. Why build a brand new supermax when we already have one, waiting? The truth is, reopening Alcatraz wouldn't just be about logistics, it would be about symbolism. Sending a criminal to the Rock would send a message: you've reached the end of the line. But the questions are many. Could the crumbling infrastructure even be restored to modern standards? Would it be humane by today's prison regulations? And perhaps most importantly, should it be reopened at all? There's another layer to this story, one that doesn't show up in government reports. Visitors and former guards have spoken of strange occurrences on the island. Footsteps in empty corridors, doors slamming by themselves, whispers in the dead of night. Paranormal investigators claim Alcatraz is one of the most haunted places in America. If those stories are true, reopening the prison wouldn't just mean locking up flesh and blood criminals. It might mean bringing them into contact with something far older and far more dangerous. Could Alcatraz reopen? The answer isn't simple. It's tangled in history, politics, money, and maybe even the supernatural. In our next chapter, we'll go back to the beginning, to the birth of the island's dark legend, and the secrets it still keeps beneath the surface. Before it became America's most notorious prison, before the world knew its name as a place of no return, Alcatraz was just a rock, a barren, wind-battered chunk of stone rising out of the icy waters of San Francisco Bay. The earliest recorded sighting of Alcatraz comes from Spanish explorers in 1775. Lieutenant Juan Manuel de Ayala mapped the island and named it La Isla de los Alcatrazes, the island of the pelicans. Back then, it was a nesting ground for seabirds, white with guano, reeking of salt and decay. No one lived there. No one wanted to. Its isolation was perfect, and its terrain brutal. Even in those early years, its destiny was forming. It was a place where you could put something, or someone, and never worry about them coming back. By the mid-1800s, the United States was expanding westward. California had been admitted as a state in 1850, and gold fever was swelling the population of San Francisco almost overnight. With riches pouring in and ships crowding the bay, the U.S. military saw a need, a fortress to guard the gateway to the city. In 1853, construction began on a massive defensive installation on Alcatraz. They blasted rock, carved gun positions into the cliffs, and hauled heavy cannons up by hand. By the late 1850s, Alcatraz bristled with armaments. From its vantage point, soldiers could sweep the entire bay with cannon fire. The message was clear: this is our harbor, and it's untouchable. But the military soon discovered something else about the island. It wasn't just good for keeping enemies out. It was perfect for keeping prisoners in. During the American Civil War, Alcatraz quietly shifted from military outpost to military prison. Soldiers who deserted, mutinied, or committed crimes were shipped here. Confederate sympathizers, political prisoners, and even Native Americans accused of resisting U.S. expansion were held in cramped cells carved into the gun decks. Conditions were harsh. Prisoners slept on straw mats. The damp sea air rotted wood and rusted metal. Water was limited, and the wind never stopped. But from the military's perspective, it worked. No one escaped. No one even tried. One of the most overlooked chapters in Alcatraz's early history involves the imprisonment of Native American leaders. Among them was Paiute war chief Captain Jack, captured in 1873 after the Modoc War. Alongside his warriors, he was sent to Alcatraz as an exemplar, warning to others resisting U.S. authority. They were thousands of miles from home, cut off from their people, surrounded by a bay they couldn't cross. It was an early demonstration of Alcatraz's true power: psychological isolation. By the late 19th century, Alcatraz had become the official U.S. military prison for the Pacific region. More barracks were converted into cell blocks. Guard towers went up. The armory wasn't for defending against ships anymore, it was for defending against inmates. The prison population shifted constantly. Deserters from the Navy, soldiers accused of murder, civilians caught spying. One inmate, Private William C. Reiter, was convicted of murdering an officer. Records show he spent nearly 2 years in solitary confinement, on the island, locked in a cell barely large enough to lie down in, with no contact with the outside world except for a guard sliding his food through a slot. The turning point came in 1898, during the Spanish-American War. The conflict brought in a surge of prisoners, both American servicemen convicted of crimes and captured Spanish sailors. Alcatraz's cells overflowed. The military began constructing a massive concrete cell house on the island's highest point, a fortress within a fortress. This was the beginning of the structure that would one day become infamous worldwide. The beauty of Alcatraz, at least for its wardens, was that nature did half the work. Cold, fast currents. Even Olympic swimmers would struggle to make it to shore, alive. Sheer cliffs, scaling the island's edges without being spotted, was nearly impossible. Isolation. The mainland was close enough to see but too far to reach, a cruel reminder to inmates of what they couldn't have. These natural barriers gave Alcatraz a reputation that would become a powerful psychological weapon. Prisoners weren't just locked up, they were marooned. Although the island's reputation was ironclad, not everyone accepted it. The first recorded escape attempt came in 1875, when a soldier named William Workman slipped away during a work detail. He made it to the water, but the current carried him out to the open sea. His body was found days later. There were others men who tried to lash together driftwood or swim under the cover of fog. Most were recaptured shivering on the rocks, too exhausted to continue. The rest never came back. By the early 20th century, Alcatraz was no longer just a military prison, it was a symbol. To be sent there meant you had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Soldiers feared it. Civilians whispered about it. And then, in the 1930s, with Prohibition gangsters and Depression-era bank robbers making headlines, the U.S. Justice Department saw an opportunity. They needed a place to house the most dangerous federal prisoners, men too violent, too cunning, or too influential to keep anywhere else. A place from which escape would be impossible. Alcatraz was ready. In 1933, control of the island was officially transferred from the U.S. Army to the Bureau of Prisons. The transformation began immediately. High walls went up. New guard towers rose above the yard. Cell doors were replaced with solid steel. And most importantly, a new philosophy took hold. Alcatraz would not be a prison for rehabilitation, it would be a prison for containment. By the time the first federal prisoners arrived in 1934, Alcatraz had already been hardened by decades of isolation and fear. But the Bureau of Prisons was about to take it further, much further. The Rock would become a place where hope went to die, and where even the most feared men in America would learn the meaning of true imprisonment. August 11, 1934. A fog hangs over San Francisco Bay, heavy and still. Out on the water, a small flotilla of boats moves toward a dark silhouette in the distance. On board, 45 of America's most dangerous prisoners, bound for the place they will soon call hell. These men weren't fresh-faced first-timers. They were veterans of crime, career gangsters, escape artists, violent killers. All had one thing in common: they had caused too much trouble in other prisons. The Bureau of Prisons had made it clear: Alcatraz wasn't a rehabilitation facility. It wasn't a step toward freedom. It was the end of the line. The convoy that day was guarded like a military operation. Federal agents in suits, armed guards with rifles, Coast Guard cutters flanking the transport boat. No one was taking chances. Inside, the prisoners were shackled, handcuffed, and in some cases, gagged. The smell of sweat and fear mixed with the salt air as they stared at the looming island. For some, the sight of Alcatraz triggered defiance. For others, quiet resignation. They had heard the stories that no one escaped, that the guards were merciless, that the cold waters were a death sentence. When they docked, the men were herded onto the island and marched up the steep slope toward the cell house. They passed under the sign that would become infamous: United States Penitentiary, Alcatraz, Island, Area 12 acres, keep out. Among the early wave of inmates was Alphonse Al Capone, the Chicago mob boss whose criminal empire had once raked in an estimated $100 million a year. In other prisons, Capone had been treated like royalty, bribing guards, running rackets from his cell, even playing in a prison band. But at Alcatraz, Warden James A. Johnston had other plans. Capone was assigned a standard 9 by 5 foot cell. No special treatment, no visitors outside strict regulations, and no contact with his criminal associates. Capone himself would later admit, "It looks like Alcatraz has got me licked." The isolation and strict routine began to wear on him. He developed symptoms of neurosyphilis, his mental sharpness fading. By the time he left in 1939, the once feared kingpin was a broken man. Another headline inmate was George Kelly Barnes, better known as Machine Gun Kelly, a Prohibition-era gangster and kidnapper. Kelly had become a media sensation. But at Alcatraz, he found himself stripped of that larger-than-life persona. Guards referred to him as Popgun Kelly after he showed a lack of toughness in prison life. Inmates whispered that Kelly's reputation had been inflated by the press, and at the Rock, reality had a way of catching up with you fast. Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz, was perhaps the most curious of the island's residents. Convicted of murder, Stroud had spent decades in prison, during which he famously kept and studied birds. But here's the twist: at Alcatraz, he had no birds at all. The nickname came from his time at Leavenworth, not the Rock. In fact, Stroud was kept in near-total isolation due to his violent tendencies toward staff. Despite his notoriety, Stroud's life here was monotonous day after day in his cell. Cut off from the feathered companions that had once given him purpose, life in Alcatraz was defined by one word: control. Wake-up call, 6:30 a.m., signaled by a loud buzzer. Breakfast, oatmeal, bread, coffee, nothing fancy. Work assignments, laundry, metal shop, or kitchen duty. Silence policy. For much of its history, talking was limited to meals and recreation. Lights out, 9:30 p.m. sharp. The guards enforced rules with precision. Infractions meant solitary confinement, the dreaded hole, where inmates sat in darkness, often with no clothes, for days at a time. Prisoners could see the lights of San Francisco from the yard. On New Year's Eve, some claimed they could hear laughter and music drifting across the bay. That, more than the bars, was torture, the constant reminder of a world just out of reach. Among the prisoners were men who had tried and often succeeded in escaping other facilities. Alcatraz was built to crush that spirit. The cell house had 3 main cell blocks, A, B, and C. Behind them was the dreaded D block, home to solitary cells and punishment cells known as strip cells, where inmates could be kept in complete darkness. Security was multi-layered, gun towers overlooking the yard, armed guards patrolling the corridors, a 15-foot fence topped with barbed wire surrounding the complex, and beyond that, the water. Always the water. It didn't take long for someone to test the system. In December 1937, Theodore Cole and Ralph Rowe filed through the bars in a workshop, slipped into the bay, and vanished. The official report said they drowned, but no bodies were recovered. That uncertainty would become a recurring theme in Alcatraz history. Did they drown, or did they somehow make it? By the late 1930s, Alcatraz's reputation was secure. The press called it America's Devil's Island. Stories of its strict discipline, its infamous inmates, and its supposedly unbreakable security filled newspapers. For the government, that reputation was as valuable as the prison itself. Even criminals who never set foot on the island feared it. The Rock wasn't just a prison. It was a psychological weapon. It broke the bodies of men, and it broke their will. But the longer it operated, the more it became a challenge to the restless and the desperate. And soon, Alcatraz would face the escape attempt that would define it forever. It's the night of June 11, 1962. Somewhere inside the high walls of Alcatraz, 3 men are about to attempt the impossible. They're not gangsters seeking headlines. They're not looking for a quick thrill. They're looking for one thing: freedom. The ringleader was Frank Morrison, man whose IQ reportedly ranked in the top 2% of the population. Orphaned at a young age, Maurice had spent most of his life in and out of prison, his talent escaping them. Alongside him were Clarence and John Anglin, brothers from rural Georgia. They had grown up swimming in the frigid waters of Lake Michigan, a skill that would later give them an edge most inmates didn't have. There was a 4th conspirator, Alan West, who shared their plan but wouldn't make it out that night. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment escape. It was the result of over a year of careful planning, improvisation, and a staggering amount of patience. The men began by widening the ventilation ducts in the back of their cells, using stolen spoons and makeshift tools fashioned from discarded saw blades. They chipped away at the concrete, concealing the damage with cardboard painted to match the wall. Behind those ducts was an unguarded utility corridor, hidden highway that ran behind their cells. From the corridor, they climbed a network of pipes up to the roof. But they couldn't just leave the prison unnoticed. They needed time and a convincing cover. So they crafted dummy heads out of plaster, soap, and human hair collected from the prison barbershop. At night, they placed the heads on their pillows, tucked under blankets to create the illusion of sleeping bodies. In the dim light, guards walking past saw nothing unusual. The escape route didn't end at the fence. Beyond the prison walls lay the cold, unforgiving waters of San Francisco Bay. Strong currents, 50–55 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures, and a nearly 2-mile swim to shore. The solution: a makeshift raft and life vessel constructed from over 50 stolen raincoats. They sealed the seams with heat from prison pipes and glue from the workshop. They even built crude paddles from scrap wood. On that night, everything was ready. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers slipped through the holes in their cell walls into the utility corridor. Alan West, however, discovered that the cement around his vent had hardened. He couldn't break through in time. He was left behind. The trio climbed the plumbing pipes, reached the roof, and crossed to the northeast corner of the prison. There, they slid down a 50-foot vent pipe to the ground outside the prison walls. They hauled their raft to the shoreline, inflated it with a concertina squeezebox instrument they had stolen and pushed off into the darkness. And from that moment, they were gone. The next morning, guards discovered the dummy heads during routine bed checks. By the time the alarm went up, the fugitives had been gone for hours. The FBI launched an exhaustive manhunt. Boats scoured the bay. Helicopters searched from above. Law enforcement swarmed the shoreline for miles. What they found was both fascinating and frustrating. A makeshift paddle floating near the Golden Gate Bridge. A wallet belonging to one of the Anglin brothers, containing family photos and contacts. Bits of raincoat material washed up on shore, but no bodies, no definitive proof of survival or death. The FBI's official stance was that the men drowned. The cold water and powerful currents, they argued, would have been too much for even strong swimmers. The case was closed in 1979, with the Bureau declaring it impossible that the men made it to shore alive. But not everyone agreed. Over the years, rumors and pieces of evidence have surfaced. Family testimonies. Relatives of the Anglin brothers claimed to have received unsigned postcards and mysterious phone calls. A photograph. In 2015, a photograph emerged, allegedly showing the Anglin brothers living in Brazil in the 1970s. Facial recognition experts were divided. Some said it was a match. Others were skeptical. The 2013 letter, a letter sent to the San Francisco Police Department, claimed to be from John Anglin, stating that he, Clarence, and Morris had all survived the escape and lived under assumed identities. It read, "Yes, we all made it that night, but barely." The FBI tested the letter for fingerprints and DNA, but results were inconclusive. If they did survive, how did they avoid capture for decades? Who helped them on the outside? And perhaps most intriguing, why would they stay hidden for so long if they had escaped the clutches of the Rock? Some believe they drowned within sight of freedom. Others think they slipped into the shadows, aided by organized crime or sympathetic family. The truth, it's locked away as tightly as the cells they once called home. The escape of 1962 remains Alcatraz's greatest mystery, a puzzle with pieces scattered across decades. Whether Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers lie at the bottom of the bay, or walk among us under different names, is something we may never know. But their story would forever change how the world saw Alcatraz. March 21, 1963. A grey, overcast morning. Guards escort the last group of inmates down the cold concrete steps of Alcatraz Island onto a waiting ferry. The prison that had been called the Rock, Alcatraz, and America's Devil's Island is shutting its gates for the final time. For 29 years, Alcatraz had been the ultimate symbol of federal power. Now, it was finished. The official explanation was simple. It cost too much to run, and it was falling apart. But in a place built on secrets, some wondered, was that the whole truth? By the early 1960s, the numbers told an ugly story. Annual operating cost, about $10 per prisoner per day, nearly triple that of other federal prisons. Maintenance issues. Saltwater corrosion had eaten away at pipes, metal bars, and concrete walls. Water supply. All fresh water had to be ferried in from the mainland. Waste had to be shipped out. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy publicly stated that the decision to close Alcatraz was based purely on economics and infrastructure. A new, modern federal penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, would replace it. It was, on paper, a rational move. What the official statements didn't emphasize was just how dangerous and politically sensitive Alcatraz had become. The prison had weathered multiple escape attempts, including the high-profile, unresolved case of 1962, increasing tension between guards and inmates, a growing awareness, even in the early 1960s, of human rights concerns in America's prisons. The more famous Alcatraz became in newspapers and on TV, the more it became a symbol, and not always the kind the government wanted. The escape of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers happened just 9 months before closure. Officially, the FBI concluded the men drowned. Unofficially, doubts lingered. Some insiders claimed that if the trio had survived, It would have been a public relations disaster, a direct blow to the escape-proof image the government had cultivated. Shutting the prison down within the year conveniently ended further escape attempts and removed the risk of another embarrassment. There were also whispers, the kind not found in official archives, that Alcatraz had become a political liability. In 1963, the civil rights movement was gaining momentum. The US was trying to project an image of justice and fairness on the world stage, particularly during the Cold War. A crumbling, inhumane island prison, one that some foreign journalists, compared to medieval dungeons, didn't fit that image. There's even speculation that the Kennedy administration saw the closure as a symbolic gesture, shutting down America's most notorious prison as proof of progress. Another layer of speculation comes from former inmates and guards, who later spoke about strange activities in the prisoner's final years. Some claimed that certain prisoners were subjected to psychological experiments, prolonged solitary confinement, sensory deprivation, and behavioral conditioning techniques. While no solid proof has ever been released, these claims echo known CIA programs of the era, such as MKUltra, which experimented on unwitting subjects in the name of mind control research. If anything like that had occurred on Alcatraz, shutting it down would have buried the evidence, or at least made access to it far more difficult. There's one more theory, less dramatic, but still compelling. In the early 1960s, environmental scientists began raising alarms about pollution in San Francisco Bay. Waste from the prison, along with chemicals from maintenance work, was leaching into the water. For an administration increasingly aware of public opinion, the optics of a federal prison poisoning the bay would have been disastrous. On that final morning, the routine was somber but efficient. Inmates were loaded onto ferries in small groups, bound for other federal facilities. Guards carried out their duties quietly, some relieved, others sentimental. One guard later recalled, "It was strange, like closing a chapter in a book you didn't think would end." The last inmate to leave was Frank Weatherman, serving time for robbery. Asked how he felt about being the final prisoner off the rock, he reportedly said, "Alcatraz was never no good for nobody." Once emptied, the island sat in limbo. The government considered selling it, even demolishing the structures, but public interest kept it alive. The mystery, the escape stories, the infamy. By 1973, the National Park Service had turned it into a tourist attraction. The same cells that once held America's most dangerous criminals were now open to anyone with the price of a ferry ticket. Was it money, infrastructure, politics, or was Alcatraz simply a relic of an older, harsher era of incarceration? The truth is likely a blend. Yes, it was expensive to operate. Yes, it was crumbling, but it was also a symbol the government may have wanted to quietly retire before it embarrassed them again. Alcatraz didn't close because it failed. In many ways, it succeeded too well. It became larger than life, a fortress in the bay, a name that sent shivers down the spine. And perhaps, for the people in power, that was the problem. When the last prisoner left Alcatraz in 1963, the rock was silent for the first time in decades. No clanging cell doors, no shouts from the yard, no footsteps of guards patrolling the tiers. The island became a ghost of itself. But that silence didn't last. In the years that followed, Alcatraz would transform into something else entirely. Part historical monument, part tourist attraction, and part haunted legend. For nearly a decade after closure, the island sat in limbo. The buildings, battered by salt air, began to crumble. Paint peeled from the walls, metal rusted, windows shattered. The government wasn't sure what to do with it. There were proposals to turn it into a shopping center, a casino, even a monument to peace. None of them stuck. But the legend of Alcatraz had already taken root in the public imagination. People still whispered about escape attempts, notorious inmates, and the belief that the prison was cursed. In 1969, the island's story took a surprising turn. A group of Native American activists, calling themselves the Indians of all tribes, occupied Alcatraz. They claimed the island under an 1868 treaty that allowed Native Americans to reclaim unused federal land. For 19 months, they lived there, using the island as a platform to raise awareness about Native American rights and conditions. "We reclaim this island in the name of all Native Americans." The occupation ended in 1971 after federal marshals removed the remaining activists, but it left a permanent mark on the island's history, a reminder that Alcatraz was more than just a prison. In 1973, the National Park Service opened Alcatraz to the public as part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. The first year, over 50,000 visitors came to walk through the cell block, stand in the yard, and peer into the solitary confinement cells. Today, over 1.4 million people visit the island each year. The ferry ride itself is a ritual. The slow approach across the bay, the sight of the weathered guard towers, the imposing cell house on the hill. Guided audio tours let visitors hear the voices of former inmates and guards, recorded decades after the prison closed. Stories of violence, isolation, and escape play in their ears as they stand in the very spots where history happened. But as soon as tourists began to visit, so did the ghost stories. Visitors reported cold spots in warm weather, the sound of footsteps following them in empty corridors, and the distant clang of doors that hadn't been used in years. Former guards told of hearing sobbing in solitary cells long after they were empty. Others swore they heard banjo music, perhaps the ghost of Al Capone, who played in the prison band. One particularly infamous location is cell 14D in D Block, known as the Hole. Paranormal investigators have called it one of the most oppressive spaces they've ever entered. People report feeling a sudden heaviness, as if the air itself is pushing down on them. Perhaps the most famous ghost story involves an event from the 1940s. An inmate in solitary claimed to see glowing red eyes in the darkness. He screamed through the night, begging for help. Guards, assuming he was faking, ignored him. The next morning, they found him dead, strangled. The official report listed it as an accident, but some guards whispered that they had counted one more prisoner in the cell than should have been there. By the 1980s and 90s, Alcatraz had fully crossed over into pop culture. Movies, TV shows, novels, and video games turned it into a setting for heists, horror stories, and supernatural thrillers. In some versions, the prison was haunted by the ghosts of its inmates. In others, it was secretly still in use, holding prisoners too dangerous to ever release. The more the legend grew, the harder it became to separate fact from fiction. Shows like Ghost Hunters, Most Haunted, and Destination Fear have all filmed episodes on the island. Investigators claim to have recorded disembodied voices calling their names, sudden temperature drops in sealed rooms, EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, of cries, whispers, and laughter, apparitions of men in guard uniforms walking the tiers. Skeptics point to the island's atmosphere, the creaks of old wood, the whistling of wind through cracked windows, the power of suggestion in a place so steeped in fear. But believers say to many witnesses, from tourists to staff, have experienced the same phenomena for it all to be coincidence. Ghost stories or not, the National Park Service has leaned into the island's eerie reputation. Night tours allow visitors to explore after dark, with the San Francisco skyline glowing in the distance. Walking through the dimly lit cell blocks, hearing the faint slap of waves against the seawall, it's easy to imagine the place alive again. The guards, the inmates, the constant tension. Some say the island feels different at night, quieter, heavier, as if the walls themselves remember. Over time, the myth of Alcatraz has become just as important as its history. Tourists don't just come to learn about the past, they come to feel it, to stand where Capone stood, to peek into the cell of the Birdman, to wonder if Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers really made it, and perhaps, to sense the presence of those who never left. Alcatraz, the prison, may have died in 1963, but Alcatraz, the legend, was just beginning. The Rock became a stage for history, politics, activism, and the supernatural. It was no longer just an island in the bay. It was a story, one that grows a little bigger every time it's told. In 1963, Alcatraz closed its doors with the reputation of being the most secure prison in America. But that was before drones, before thermal cameras, before the era of AI and biometric scanning. Today, the world's most dangerous prisons are equipped with technology that the wardens of Alcatraz could only dream of, which raises the question, could the Rock be reopened and made even more escape-proof than before? In its prime, Alcatraz relied on three main defenses: geography, isolation by cold, treacherous waters, physical barriers, thick concrete walls, heavy steel bars, armed guards, trained men stationed in towers, on catwalks, and in corridors. It worked, most of the time. But the escape of 1962 proved that even escape-proof prisons have cracks. If Alcatraz reopened today, its defenses would look very different. Modern prisons use a blend of physical fortification and cutting-edge surveillance that would make the old rock seem primitive. Biometric access control. Every staff member and visitor is scanned via fingerprint or retina to prevent infiltration. 360-degree AI surveillance. Cameras equipped with facial recognition and movement analytics monitor every inch of the facility in real time. RFID tracking. Inmates wear tamper-proof bracelets or implants that broadcast their exact location at all times. Drone patrols. Autonomous drones patrol the island perimeter and surrounding waters, scanning for movement day and night. Thermal imaging and motion sensors, able to detect a human body even in complete darkness or heavy fog. Automated lockdown systems. AI-driven control centers can instantly seal cell blocks at the first sign of trouble. With these tools, an escape attempt wouldn't just be dangerous, it would be nearly suicidal. The physical island itself could also be transformed. Seawall motion sensors detect any attempt to scale down to the waterline. Anti-swim technology, underwater sonar buoys that alert guards if anyone enters the water, paired with fast-response interceptor boats. Perimeter lighting, high-intensity floodlights with infrared capability to pierce through fog. Hardened structures, replacing decayed concrete with reinforced corrosion-resistant composites. Even the once overlooked maintenance tunnels and utility corridors, a weak point in the original design, could be sealed with smart gates requiring biometric clearance. In 1960, a guard's tools were a keyring, a rifle, and a radio. In a modernized Alcatraz, guards could be augmented by body cams that stream live to a central command center. Augmented reality AR visors providing real-time overlays of inmate identities and potential threat levels. Non-lethal weapons like directed energy stunners or microwave-based crowd control systems to neutralize riots without gunfire. Technology alone can't make a prison unbreakable, but the fear of technology might. Imagine an inmate knowing that every movement is tracked, every conversation is recorded and transcribed in real time, every step toward an escape triggers an immediate, automated lockdown. In the old days, prisoners could at least dream of escape. In a modernized rock, the dream might die before it starts. Some prison experts argue that the isolation of Alcatraz is outdated in the era of supermax facilities, like ADX Florence in Colorado, a land-based prison often called the Alcatraz of the Rockies. At ADX, inmates are confined to their cells for 23 hours a day, with virtually no contact with other humans. The facility is inland, far from any escape-friendly terrain, and already incorporates much of the tech that a modernized Alcatraz would use. The question becomes, would the government really spend billions to retrofit a decaying island when facilities like ADX already exist? Reopening Alcatraz wouldn't be cheap. Engineers estimate it would require hundreds of millions in structural restoration, complete replacement of utilities, plumbing, and electrical systems, a permanent ferry or bridge connection for staff and supplies, high-tech infrastructure that would need constant maintenance in a harsh marine environment. Saltwater and electronics mix, meaning high-tech systems would degrade faster here than in a landlocked facility. If logic says don't reopen it, symbolism might say otherwise. Alcatraz isn't just a prison, it's an icon. Reopening it could serve as a political statement. The worst of the worst will go here. This is where justice is absolute. In an era when leaders often look for powerful, highly visible symbols of law and order, the Rock could serve as a ready-made brand. But not everyone sees reopening Alcatraz as a good idea. Critics argue it would be an expensive vanity project with little practical benefit. The location makes it harder to provide rehabilitation programs, mental health services, or family visitation. The island's conditions, cold, damp, and isolating, could be challenged as cruel and unusual punishment. Under modern legal standards, no prison is 100% escape-proof. History has proven that. But with today's tech, the margin for error could be writ within. A modern Alcatraz would be under 24/7 aerial, thermal, and underwater surveillance. Every entry point could be locked down in seconds. Any movement toward the water would trigger instant response from drone teams and patrol boats. But the irony, the escape attempts, and the legends they spawned, are a big part of what made Alcatraz famous. Without the possibility of failure, would the Rock lose some of its mystique? The technology exists to make Alcatraz more secure than ever. But whether it should rise again depends on more than steel and sensors. It depends on politics, money, and a willingness to resurrect the ghosts of its past. In the 1930s, Alcatraz was a simple equation. Commit the worst crimes, cause trouble in other prisons, and you end up here. No debate, no national conversation. But today, the idea of reopening the Rock would ignite one of the fiercest political and ethical battles in America. If the federal government proposed reopening Alcatraz today, the country would split almost instantly. On one side, tough and crime politicians calling it a necessary move to contain the most dangerous inmates, law enforcement unions supporting the idea as a way to send a strong deterrent message, certain segments of the public who see the Rock as a symbol of uncompromising justice. On the other side, civil rights groups warning against cruel and unusual punishment, prison reform advocates arguing the money could be better spent on rehabilitation programs, environmental activists concerned about the ecological impact of operating a high-security facility in San Francisco Bay. Supporters would say, reopening Alcatraz is about more than just housing prisoners. It's about sending a message. Imagine the headlines: notorious gang leader sent to the Rock, terror suspect transferred to America's island prison. For advocates, it's about restoring a sense of consequence. The Rock, they argue, was a place where criminals' reputations ended, where no one could run their empire from behind bars. They point to the old Alcatraz model: strict discipline, minimal privileges, complete separation from the outside world. But in the 21st century, incarceration isn't just about punishment, at least, not officially. International human rights standards emphasize rehabilitation, humane conditions, and mental health care. Opponents would argue that Alcatraz's isolation, damp climate, and psychological toll are inherently inhumane. They'd say reopening it risks lawsuits, international criticism, and a public relations nightmare. Some would compare it to solitary confinement on a massive scale, something that many experts already call a form of psychological torture when prolonged. Even those who agree with the idea in theory might balk at the cost. Rebuilding the facility to modern standards could run into hundreds of millions of dollars, with ongoing operating expenses far exceeding those of mainland prisons. Critics would ask, why spend that kind of money to reopen a relic when the U.S. prison system is already struggling with overcrowding, staff shortages, and underfunded rehabilitation programs? Supporters, in turn, would argue that Alcatraz could actually save money in the long run by concentrating the most dangerous inmates in one ultra-secure location, reducing escapes, riots, and the need for expensive emergency responses elsewhere. The media's role would be huge. News networks would replay black-and-white footage of Al Capone on the island, dramatizations of the 1962 escape, and chilling shots of empty cell blocks. Public opinion would likely shift, depending on events. A high-profile prison escape or violent incident elsewhere could fuel calls to reopen the Rock. Conversely, stories about wrongful convictions or prison abuse could turn the tide against it. Internationally, reopening Alcatraz could be seen in two very different ways. As a power statement, reinforcing America's reputation for strong law enforcement. As a step backward, signaling a return to punitive models criticized by many developed nations. Countries with more rehabilitative justice systems might view it as archaic, even barbaric, but others, especially those battling violent organized crime, might quietly admire the move. Perhaps the most contentious debate would center on the ethics of extreme isolation. Supporters would argue that certain criminals, terrorists, gang leaders, serial killers, are simply too dangerous to house in normal facilities. They use their influence to order hits, traffic contraband, and run operations from inside prison walls. Opponents would counter that isolation at the level Alcatraz could impose causes lasting psychological damage. They point to studies showing that prolonged sensory deprivation and lack of human contact can lead to depression, paranoia, hallucinations, and even suicide. The question becomes, does public safety justify the mental deterioration of inmates? Some experts might propose a compromise, a hybrid model, where Alcatraz functions not as a full-time prison, but as a short-term high-security holding facility for the most dangerous or disruptive inmates. Inmates could be sent there temporarily as a disciplinary measure, then returned to mainland facilities once deemed manageable. This could preserve the symbolic power of the rock without committing to full-scale operations year-round. The most powerful force in the debate might not be facts or figures, but symbolism. Alcatraz is a name everyone knows. It's woven into America's cultural DNA, a place of fear, finality, and myth. For some, that's exactly why it should be brought back. For others, it's exactly why it should stay closed. Reopening Alcatraz isn't just about bricks and bars. It is about who we are as a country, and whether we still believe in a place that was designed to strip away hope. But even as politicians and activists argue, another force continues to shape the conversation, one that has nothing to do with budgets or blueprints. Because Alcatraz isn't just a historical site. For many, it's a living, breathing presence, and some say its ghosts are very real. In the 1930s, Alcatraz was a simple equation. Commit the worst crimes, cause trouble in other prisons, and you end up here. No debate, no national conversation. But today, the idea of reopening the rock would ignite one of the fiercest political and ethical battles in America. If the federal government proposed reopening Alcatraz today, the country would split almost instantly. On one side, tough and crime politicians calling it a necessary move to contain the most dangerous inmates, law enforcement unions supporting the idea as a way to send a strong deterrent message, certain segments of the public who see the rock as a symbol of uncompromising justice. On the other side, civil rights groups warning against cruel and unusual punishment, prison reform advocates arguing the money could be better spent on rehabilitation programs, environmental activists concerned about the ecological impact of operating a high-security facility in San Francisco Bay. Supporters would say, reopening Alcatraz is about more than just housing prisoners. It's about sending a message. Imagine the headlines: notorious gang leader sent to the rock, terror suspect transferred to America's island prison. For advocates, it's about restoring a sense of consequence. The rock, they argue, was a place where criminals' reputations ended, where no one could run their empire from behind bars. They point to the old Alcatraz model: strict discipline, minimal privileges, complete separation from the outside world. But in the 21st century, incarceration isn't just about punishment, at least, not officially. International human rights standards emphasize rehabilitation, humane conditions, and mental health care. Opponents would argue that Alcatraz's isolation, damp climate, and psychological toll are inherently inhumane. They'd say reopening it risks lawsuits, international criticism, and a public relations nightmare. Some would compare it to solitary confinement on a massive scale, something that many experts already call a form of psychological torture when prolonged. Even those who agree with the idea in theory might balk at the cost. Rebuilding the facility to modern standards could run into hundreds of millions of dollars, with ongoing operating expenses far exceeding those of mainland prisons. Critics would ask, why spend that kind of money to reopen a relic when the U.S. prison system is already struggling with overcrowding, staff shortages, and underfunded rehabilitation programs? Supporters, in turn, would argue that Alcatraz could actually save money in the long run by concentrating the most dangerous inmates in one ultra-secure location, reducing escapes, riots, and the need for expensive emergency responses elsewhere. The media's role would be huge. News networks would replay black-and-white footage of Al Capone on the island, dramatizations of the 1962 escape, and chilling shots of empty cell blocks. Public opinion would likely shift, depending on events. A high-profile prison escape or violent incident elsewhere could fuel calls to reopen the rock. Conversely, stories about wrongful convictions or prison abuse could turn the tide against it. Internationally, reopening Alcatraz could be seen in two very different ways. As a power statement, reinforcing America's reputation for strong law enforcement. As a step backward, signaling a return to punitive models criticized by many developed nations. Countries with more rehabilitative justice systems might view it as archaic, even barbaric, but others, especially those battling violent organized crime, might quietly admire the move. Perhaps the most contentious debate would center on the ethics of extreme isolation. Supporters would argue that certain criminals, terrorists, gang leaders, serial killers, are simply too dangerous to house in normal facilities. They use their influence to order hits, traffic contraband, and run operations from inside prison walls. Opponents would counter that isolation at the level Alcatraz could impose causes lasting psychological damage. They point to studies showing that prolonged sensory deprivation and lack of human contact can lead to depression, paranoia, hallucinations, and even suicide. The question becomes, does public safety justify the mental deterioration of inmates? Some experts might propose a compromise, a hybrid model, where Alcatraz functions not as a full-time prison, but as a short-term high-security holding facility for the most dangerous or disruptive inmates. Inmates could be sent there temporarily as a disciplinary measure, then returned to mainland facilities once deemed manageable. This could preserve the symbolic power of the Rock without committing to full-scale operations year-round. The most powerful force in the debate might not be facts or figures, but symbolism. Alcatraz is a name everyone knows. It's woven into America's cultural DNA, a place of fear, finality, and myth. For some, that's exactly why it should be brought back. For others, it's exactly why it should stay closed. Reopening Alcatraz isn't just about bricks and bars. It is about who we are as a country, and whether we still believe in a place that was designed to strip away hope. But even as politicians and activists argue, another force continues to shape the conversation, one that has nothing to do with budgets or blueprints. Because Alcatraz isn't just a historical site. For many, it's a living, breathing presence, and some say its ghosts are very real. Alcatraz was built to hold the most dangerous criminals in America. But ask the people who've walked its halls in the years since it closed, and they'll tell you, some of its residents never left. Over the decades, guards, inmates, and later tourists have all reported strange occurrences on the island. Sounds without sources, shadows where no one should be, and feelings that something unseen is watching. The most infamous location is Cell 1 for D, deep inside D Block, known to inmates as the Hole. Inmates sent here spent up to 19 days in near total darkness. The cell had no mattress, no sink, no toilet, just a hole in the floor and 4 concrete walls. Former guard George Tex Hendricks once described stepping into 1-4D as like walking into a refrigerator. Even on hot days, the air inside felt unnaturally cold. Tourists on night tours have reported the same, a sudden drop in temperature, the sensation of icy fingers brushing their arms, and in some cases, the overwhelming urge to get out immediately. One of Alcatraz's oldest ghost stories dates back to the 1940s. A prisoner placed in 14D began screaming just minutes after the door was shut. He claimed he could see glowing red eyes staring at him from the darkness. His shouts continued all night, ignored by guards who thought he was faking panic to get out early. The next morning, he was found dead, strangled, with marks around his neck. The official report listed suicide, but some guards swore they counted 2 men in the cell during head count the night before. The second man, they said, was wearing a guard's uniform and vanished before anyone could confront him. After Al Capone's health declined due to syphilis, he was allowed to spend time in the prison hospital, where he reportedly played the banjo to pass the time. Decades after his death, staff have reported hearing faint banjo music coming from the shower room, the very place Capone was said to practice. The sound stops abruptly when anyone enters. The prison hospital, now closed to the public, has its own reputation. Paranormal investigators have captured unexplained sounds there, footsteps echoing down empty hallways, the squeak of gurney wheels, soft moaning from rooms with no occupants. Some believe these sounds come from the spirits of inmates who died during medical treatment, or from neglect. Several visitors and staff members have reported seeing apparitions of men in guard uniforms patrolling the cell blocks. They walk their routes silently, never acknowledging those who see them, and vanish around corners that lead to dead ends. One park ranger once described locking up the cell house for the night when he saw a figure standing at the end of the corridor. Thinking it was a fellow ranger, he called out, but the man turned, saluted, and then dissolved into thin air. The mess hall was one of the most dangerous places in the prison. Every inmate gathered there 3 times a day, and the risk of fights or riots was high. Today, visitors sometimes hear the low murmur of voices in the empty room, as if dozens of people are quietly conversing. The sound fades when you try to get closer, only to start again once you step back. Ghost hunters have captured chilling EVP, electronic voice phenomena recordings on the island. A male voice saying, get out. Whispers of names not spoken by anyone present. A faint, desperate plea, help me. Skeptics argue these are just fragments of radio interference bouncing across the bay. Believers insist they're messages from the other side. Some experts say the island's paranormal reputation may be a psychological phenomenon, a mix of history, isolation, and atmosphere. The sound of wind through broken windows can mimic voices. The sudden shifts in temperature are natural on the bay, and knowing the prison's violent past primes visitors to expect something sinister. But even skeptics admit, Alcatraz has a way of getting under your skin. In 1984, a National Park Service ranger stayed overnight on the island to monitor repairs. Around 2 a.m., he heard heavy footsteps moving above him, in an area locked and inaccessible. When he went to investigate, the footsteps stopped. Moments later, he heard them again, this time behind him. He left the building and refused to work night shifts for months afterward. The Park Service offers night tours for those seeking a little more adrenaline. After sunset, the city lights glimmer across the water, but inside the cell house, shadows stretch long and the air grows heavy. Guides often warn, don't wander off. The island has a way of keeping things it likes. Some guests laugh it off, others don't. Whether the spirits of Alcatraz are real or imagined, one thing is certain. This island doesn't give up its ghosts easily. For those who believe, it's one of the most haunted places in America. For those who don't, maybe they just haven't spent a night here. From the first prisoner marched up its steep slopes, to the last guard locking its gates in 1963, Alcatraz has been more than a prison. It's been a stage, for daring escapes, for political statements, for ghost stories whispered in the dark. And even now, the island refuses to give up all its secrets. For decades, the most debated question has been, did Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers make it? Evidence both supports and challenges the idea. The family testimonies, the alleged Brazil photograph, the 2013 letter claiming survival. If they did survive, they pulled off one of the most brilliant escapes in American history and lived under the radar for the rest of their lives. But if they didn't, their bodies rest somewhere beneath the dark waters of the bay. Was the shutdown really about cost and maintenance? Or was it a quiet way to bury a growing list of embarrassments, failed escapes, and political liabilities? Some historians believe the 1962 escape tipped the scales. Others think the Kennedy administration wanted to dismantle a symbol of outdated punishment, during a time when America was trying to modernize its image. If you ask the paranormal investigators, the reason Alcatraz feels different is because it's still full of the energy, and maybe the spirits, of those who lived and died there. Could reopening the prison reawaken something best left alone? Or is the ghostly reputation just another layer of the legend, one that keeps the island's mystique alive? Some politicians argue that reopening Alcatraz could serve as a powerful symbol of justice, a modern-day fortress for the worst of the worst. But would it truly serve justice, or simply serve as a political trophy? And in an age where human rights are under global scrutiny, could the Rock survive the public relations storm? Did anyone else escape without the public ever finding out? Were there secret experiments conducted on inmates in the final years? How many of the paranormal stories have roots in real events? And if the island could speak, what else would it tell us? Maybe the mystery is the point. Maybe Alcatraz was never meant to give us all the answers. Because as long as we keep asking the questions, the Rock lives on. If you've been as fascinated by this journey through Alcatraz as we have, don't let it end here. Hit that like button to keep this story alive. Share this video with someone who loves a good mystery, and subscribe for more deep dives into the world's most haunting legends and untold histories. Every click helps us bring you the stories they don't want you to know. And trust me, the next one is going to blow your mind.